Okay, I promise to keep this short and sweet and to the point. So this concept is called eutrophication, and it's a big concept that's easy to understand. It really is. So let's get on it, okay? So the idea is this. Eutrophication occurs anytime that humans add extra nutrients into an aquatic environment. So in an aquatic environment, there's always some single-celled photosynthetic organisms called algae. And normally they can't reproduce too much because the limiting factor for them is nutrients, usually phosphorus, but also nitrogen. Remember, you need both of those in order to make DNA and lipids and things like that. And so they have plenty of light, they have plenty of water, but they don't have these nutrients they need. So what happens is if fertilizers, which have nitrogen, nitrates, and phosphates in them, get into the water supply, or if, say, animal waste from sewage or from a pig farm or something like that gets into a water body, what happens is there's this sudden explosive growth of algae because it's got everything it needs to grow except those nutrients. And once those nutrients arrive, wow, it just goes crazy. And we call that eutrophication. Now, so here's some of my lovely artwork. I hope you enjoy it. So this is supposed to be water. This is supposed to be little algae floating in the water. Now what's happening is the runoff and the groundwater, in this case, are both bringing in nitrates and phosphates, either from fertilizers or from animal waste, human sewage, whatever. And it's going to get into this body of water. And when it does, it's providing the necessary nutrients that these cells need in order to reproduce. And as soon as they get those nutrients, there's an algae explosion. We call it an algae bloom. And suddenly the water will turn green looking. And when you look at it, it will just look green a lot of the times. So basically, well, what's so bad about that? So I have a lot of plants. Aren't plants good? Isn't productivity good? Well, yeah, except something else happens that's not so good. And it is this. We get this thick mat of algae that forms. But unfortunately, the ones on the top outcompete the ones below in terms of light. And in order to live, if you're a plant, you need light. So what happens is the plants underneath, they end up getting starved of light. And so they die. And these dead ones that didn't get enough light for photosynthesis sink to the bottom. Now I have all these dead algae piling up at the bottom. Well, these dead algae, as it turns out, are food for bacteria. So the bacteria that are also in this aquatic system, now we have like a bacterial bloom, right? So they go crazy because now there's all this food for them to eat. And as they munch on this, remember, bacteria are non-photosynthetic, at least these ones are. And so what happens is they respire. And when they respire, they take oxygen out of the environment. So the dissolved oxygen in the water plummets. And that's the problem with eutrophication. It leads to a rapid diminishment of dissolved oxygen, and then all the vertebrate species that live in here, all the and invertebrate, all the animal species basically live in. I don't care if you're a snail, if you're a crawdad, if you're a fish, if you're an eel, whatever you are. If you live here and there's no oxygen, you're going to die. And so this leads to massive fish kills. So a lot of times when there is an introduction of nutrients into an aquatic system, there's an explosive growth of algae. These are actually not algae. These are plants. But it causes the death of vertebrate species, vertebrate feces, including fish and other things. Now, eutrophication is not something that just happens in lakes and rivers. It also happens in the open ocean. And that forms a thing called a dead zone. So just in the last 20 years or so, they've realized that there's these regions of the ocean in which they find no life. And what happens is you have agriculture and you have cities that produce sewage, and that carries nutrients into the ocean along with sediment. Okay. Now what happens is that leads to a plankton bloom. Right, that's standard eutrophication. The plankton below this level die; they sink to the bottom, and now they get consumed by bacteria. And so we get this region of the ocean in which there's very, very little in the way of dissolved oxygen. And so what happens is everything in there either dies or has to get the heck out of there. Right. So where we often get these are at the mouths of rivers, because rivers tend to carry a lot of these agricultural nutrients and human waste nutrients out into the ocean. So a classic place is at the mouth of the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico. You can actually see the algae from space. And when they map this area in terms of dissolved oxygen, we see they have very low oxygen in these areas here. And that's because of eutrophication. So there's this dead zone that's been measured for a long time now. We find them all over the world. They happen in all kinds of different places, but they're usually resulting where rivers are carrying nutrients into the ocean. We can take a look at the watershed of the Mississippi River. So it's a very, very large watershed. And what we've done is we've mapped out the cities in red and the agricultural areas in green. So the agricultural areas are adding nutrients from fertilizers, and the red ones are adding nutrients from sewage. And all of this ends up getting dumped here at the mouth of the Mississippi River. So we get this large dead zone that happens because of the eutrophication that occurs here. And eutrophication also happens on reefs. So in a coral reef environment, these corals, these polyps need to filter feed. It's like this symbiotic relationship between animals and these photosynthetic algae embedded in them. And what happens is this other algae just grows on top of them, and the polyps underneath are outcompeted, and then they end up dying. And when these polyps die, the reef is dead. I mean, you can't really replace it. So here's a picture of a reef before and after eutrophication occurs. So once you start growing all this algae on the coral dies, and before long, this whole coral ecosystem is gone. So that's eutrophication. Thanks for listening. I told you to keep it short and sweet.